For context, since I know this video will reach beyond my typical audience, I have been planning an ON30 model railroad on this channel for the past 2 months, slowly accumulating materials to make this project a reality. One of the biggest steps in bringing this to life came pretty early on from community member TK Productions, who happened to have some ON30 model trains lying around that he didn't need. Now, TK models an HO scale, which happens to have the same track gauge zone 30, so they could technically run together. However, ON30 is narrow gauge, meaning that the tracks in its respective scale are supposed to be small. Too long didn't read, these two scales do not work well together. So, TK was more than willing to part ways with his collection, especially since I wanted to make an ON30 layout. However, I think there was a second motive that TK had that made him so willing to get rid of this all. The stuff in his collection was like the white elephant of model trains. It was Christmas trains. Well, more specifically, Thomas Kinkade Christmas trains. Yay! Now, I don't have much of an opinion on Thomas Kinkade specifically, but these sorts of Christmas trains feel cluttered in their design, trying to fit on so much brand identity that they forget to let it breathe and be a train. This makes it feel less like a cute Christmas train to run around the Christmas tree and more like a badge of loyalty to your favorite corporate cult. Just look at this Budweiser one. What's the point of having this in your home, especially at Christmas time? Do you want to tell your friends who visit how much they need to drink your favorite beer? Does your family need to know on Christmas that Thomas Kinkade is so important to you that you put his art under your Christmas tree for the kids to play with and be mesmerized by? Despite these trains being marketed as collectible items, you can often find these on eBay for cheaper than standard undecorated models. There's barely any collectors for these items, and the few model railroaders who actually use ON30 to begin with don't want the headache of repainting these tacky cars just to make them fit on their railroad. Well, most model railroaders. I'm an exception. In part because I got these for free, but also because I think it'd be a fun challenge. And a challenge it certainly will be. I'm actually quite an amateur. I've only ever finished painting one thing in my time as a model railroader. And, well, I think it turned out quite nice, and I'm actually proud of it, but that's my entire portfolio of modeling work. And today, I not only want to add my personal spin on a passenger train car, but I also have to clean it up first, so these garish decals have been sent 6 feet under and I don't have to look at a Thomas Kinkade painting. While I may not be the most skilled modeler, I at least want to go to a train show and be able to ask someone to run this on their railroad for a bit, and not be told to go hump a thumbtack for having an ugly piece of branding, but instead I'd like to be told to go hump a thumbtack because they only want to run their own trains, even if mine looks decent. That would be a massive improvement in my opinion. So, let's begin, shall we? While I would love to get to the painting, step 1 is disassembling the car. It's just far easier to paint each piece individually than to pray you don't accidentally overpaint from one part onto another. We'll start by popping off the roof. Most of this disassembly is unscrewing or just snapping something out of position. It's pretty easy. However, the next part is actually way more complicated. We need to unsolder some wires from a small circuit board. The board isn't very complex. All it does is take power from pickups in the wheels and transfers it to an LED. There's nothing special here. But if we don't unsolder the wires here, we would damage them when trying to disassemble the rest of the car. It is possible to unscrew the wire from the trucks that are holding the wheels in place, but the holes that the wire goes through and winds through are just barely wide enough for the wire itself. The screw connector at the other end of the wire is simply too big to pull through, and you would just have to damage the wires in order to disassemble it that way. However, unsoldering the board gives an added benefit. You also get to remove the light from the car, meaning that when you have to repaint the car, you do not risk painting over the LED. This part is one that I asked for help from my father with, as he has more experience than I do. It's honestly not that hard to solder things. However, the soldering iron is roughly 315 degrees Celsius to melt the solder connecting the wire and the circuit board together, so I didn't really feel fully ready to do this job. I did get to remove the last connection, however, and despite my shaky hands and accidentally touching the soldering iron's heatsink at one point, we made it through this part with no injuries. Now, I kinda screwed up the sequencing in this next segment. Pun fully intended. I unscrewed the trucks and the floor of the car from the rest of the body before removing the walls. Now, this wasn't really impossible, nor all that hard, but it would have been way easier if the walls weren't in the way, and I would have had a better line of sight with my camera, so I could have shown you better what I was doing. Yeah, that was kind of dumb, especially because I immediately removed the walls after that, along with the baggage compartment doors. These were all held in place with little tabs and some friction, so all it took to get everything apart was some careful shoving, bending, and pulling. Next, we separated the car's floor, base, and trucks from one another, making sure to pull the wires through their small holes. All we needed to do was pull all this apart because it was already loose. We unscrewed it earlier, after all. And to wrap up our disassembly, all we need to do is remove the windows. We don't want to paint over them, after all. Some of them were held in place with glue, which just took some pushing to pop them right out, but others were held in place with friction, which took a little work to carefully pull out as to not break them. It wasn't too much work, though. And presto, our passenger car is ready for a repaint and a revamp. We'll start with the outer walls and the shell of the car. We've got to get those decals off, which is surprisingly easy to do, though a little tedious. All we need is to apply some decal solvent, which is used for both applying and removing decals, and let it sink in. We'll apply multiple coats to help speed up the process, and oh, hey, look at that. This one decal is already starting to remove itself. Crazy, huh? So, I did kind of lie a moment ago. The process isn't that tedious, but it used to be. When I first started research for this project, every guide I saw told me to use Microset or Microsol for our decal solvent. While those are great solvents in general, they're also pretty weak and slow acting, meaning your results take a long time to set in, and for decal removal in particular, it requires a lot of work rubbing away the decal on your end. My father and I spent roughly 3 hours off and on trying to remove any amount of decals before we decided to try something else because it just wasn't working. Now, our intermittent nature towards the decal removal might have made it worse on us, but even the tutorial said we'd have to spend 30 minutes at a time or something like that to get the job done. Which is, admittedly, about as long as any one step of this project takes, if not longer. But still, I'm impatient, and if we can safely speed up the process, we will. The next thing we tried was acetone. It worked really well, but we were afraid it was melting the plastic walls of the car, as the paintbrush was picking up a good chunk of the car's base paint. So, yeah, we think that was probably a mistake. The last thing we tried, but obviously not the least, it's what we're using now, was Solvaset. This is classically known in modeling groups for being far too strong when applying decals. Well, that's perfect for us, right? If it's too strong while applying decals, it'll be perfect for removing them, right? Well, my father had got some at the train store one day, and he told me he was going into the basement to experiment on a special car we had set aside for testing out decal removal techniques. No more than 5 minutes later, he came back upstairs, a wild grin on his face, and the car in his palm. He handed it to me, pointing to a spot where a decal had been before. The area was spotless. We now had a plan. Now, you might notice I'm not actually making the car spotless here. There's quite a bit of gunk left over, like cream cheese or cake frosting or something. Man, I'm hungry. While I would love to make the car perfectly clean, these little globs of paint are actually fine. We wanted to remove as much of the decals as possible because they were kind of poorly laid, covering up the little indents that separated the wooden slats on the car's sides. If we just left the decals alone, after repainting the car from top to bottom, their outlines would still appear bright as day, sticking out like a sore thumb on the side of the car. We don't want that, but since we do still plan to repaint this car into a more standard green color, some leftover decal paint isn't going to matter as long as it's not changing the texture of the car. We then went into the backyard to slather the walls in a coat or two of primer. While we do want to paint the car green, coating it in primer first will cover up the inconsistencies of the leftover decal gunk, making it easier to paint the green on with freedom. If we were to accidentally not paint on enough green to completely cover the car, the primer gray would blend in much better than the bright red of the original car. Plus, primer makes it easier for other paints to stick onto surfaces. We had to do 2 coats to make sure every crevice was covered, since there are a few things that jut out and create texture on the side of the car. You can't really paint the bottom of those things from the top of the car. So, 2 coats. Once that had dried, we did some spray painting with an airbrush. Unfortunately, the color of green we wanted to use, TCP CP Rail Action Green, is an acetone-based paint which smells so much worse than regular water-based ones. I'm extremely sensitive to some paint fumes, and I'm generally inexperienced with an airbrush, so my father did the work here. Not that it was too hard, though I totally could have done it if it weren't for the smell. It's not the only thing we spray painted, though. Let's take a little bit of a detour. After all, the car's outer walls aren't the only thing we had to modify, right? With the original roof, it was missing some windows. Since TK gave us a total of 10 passenger cars in his donation, we had a few roof windows to spare. Well, actually, we kinda just had other roofs without decals on them, which we could spare, which would skip a step in fixing up the car. So instead of trying to salvage our current roof, we just stole one in better condition from another car. For the car frame, it was missing both of its handbrakes, and one end of the car had an observation car's railings, which is supposed to only be used on a luxury observation car. We're making a not-so-luxurious combination baggage coach today, so it doesn't really fit. Conveniently, though, the donor car we stole the roof off of happened to have 2 standard car railings with both their handbrakes intact. It was missing its couplers, but it's super easy to transfer the couplers between cars, so that's not a problem. We spray painted both the roof and the frame with Badger Model Flex Weathered Black. It's a nice way to distinguish the car from other standard models while still being a fairly normal color as to not draw too much attention to the changes. Now, we didn't coat these in primer because, well, I honestly don't know why we didn't coat these in primer first. Like, I understand the roof, it was already black. If a little bit of black showed through, it didn't make any difference. But with the base, it was red? Anyways, we didn't coat them in primer, they turned out okay. We only painted the ends of the frame because that's the part that really matters, because we were trying to paint the little steps up that people would use to board the train and the railings at the end of the car. You don't really see the middle part, you know? That's not all the work we've done on other parts of the car, though. I also painted up the baggage car doors in Citadel color Baller Brown, while also painting the door on the interior partition wall the same way. This color will make for a nice contrast with the base green tones on the car's exterior. Well, at least the baggage car doors will. I'm just painting it on the one in the interior wall for the sake of consistency, since I'm going to paint the external passenger doors the same way later. Might as well make these doors the same color too, right? That's not all there is to the inside, though. While most people won't see the chairs very well from the outside, I still want to distinguish them from the color of the floor. In order to do this, I'm going to paint the seats with Americana Heritage Brick. It's a nice, dark red that makes the chairs feel like they actually have good cushions on them. For everything but the seats, we'll slather them in a coat of Americana Burnt Umber. The seat cushions may be nice, but it's still a railroad bench and is made mostly of wood. I would have removed the stove before painting the back of this one seat in particular, but for some reason it was really glued in there, and I didn't want to damage the stove or the floor and just carefully painted around it, removing any paint when I accidentally smudged the stove. You might notice that the colors are bleeding over one another, and the coat isn't strong enough since the base tan is still shining through. That's okay for two reasons. One, it'll be hard to see the car interior anyways, so a perfect paint job isn't really necessary. And two, I was already planning on doing a second coat for both the seat and the chair. But instead of doing the seat first for the second coat, I'm actually going to do the chair first. Thanks to the brown being painted on more complicated sides of the chair, and more sides in general, it's more likely to bleed over onto the seat than the red is to bleed over onto the rest of the chair. If we paint brown first, when I touch up the seat second, it'll be easier to cover up any of those little errors from painting the brown on, and I can easily remove the red that bleeds over with just my finger. So, on the second coat, brown first, red second. And presto, comfy seating. And that's all the detours for now. We've done the roof, the frame, the interior, and the doors. Now it's time to finish up the exterior. Once the green paint has dried, it's time to pull out that somewhat golden Baller brown from before and touch up the window frames, trim, and passenger doors. It's quite a tricky thing to get right, as the window frames and trim are really thin, meaning you can easily paint over onto the regular green areas on accident. As long as that overlap isn't too big, though, most people won't notice, and if it is too big, that's actually a somewhat good thing. See, if you try and smear away the big bits of paint with your finger like I do, a tiny bit of residue gets left behind. However, since we're painting in brown, the residue just looks like some natural dirt stains from the car's use. It's a surprisingly happy little accident every time it happens. Though it definitely is something you can overdo if you have too many mistakes, so still, try and be careful. Just don't give up over a few mistakes, you know? Blend them into your project. Now, this formal paint is cool, but we also kind of need a railroad name to put on the side of the car, which is why I printed off an 8.5 and 11-inch page of Waterslide decals I made myself. Well, okay, bit of a complication here actually. I designed the sheet, but I didn't actually print it off. I went to Highball Graphics and ordered from them. See, most printers can't print white. Also, some printers may have troubles with Waterslide decal paper and jam if you're not careful. So instead of trying to find a decal printer of my own or finding a local print shop that can print white on decal paper, I decided to go with an online printing service. The first one I found online was Kinkade, which is a fairly well-known model railroading brand here in the United States. They offered to print sheets starting at $30, which really isn't all that bad. But then that price skyrocketed with extra fees to use any amount of colors. White, $27. Black, $22. Metallic gold, $30. All in addition to the base price. Oh, and you can only use 3 colors at once with their printing method that can do white. My original sheet had all 3 of the colors I just listed and wound up costing around $110. Yeah, we didn't order from Kinkade. Highball Graphics, meanwhile, didn't try to trick us with hidden costs for extra colors. $40 flat, plus shipping, no matter what. On top of that, the owner answered all my questions, and when I sent over my payment and the design I wanted printed, he had it printed and shipped within the same day. I'm not sponsored, but my experience with them was a positive one, and I would recommend checking them out if you very specifically need custom waterslide decals for your trains. Anyways, I've rambled enough about buying decals. Actually applying them? Well, in contrast to removing them, it's actually pretty tedious. First, you want to cut out the decal from your sheet so you get just what you want to see on the side of the car. Then dip it in some water for around 10 to 30 seconds. While it's soaking, cover the area you want to put it on with some microsol, just so it has a base to stick to. These are waterslide decals, so after it's soaked in some water for a while, it just slides right off the paper. Just make sure to position the decal over the area you actually want to put it on before sliding it off the paper. Once it's on the car's side, we just gently use the small brush to move it around. After all, the decal is pretty fragile. Your fingers could permanently damage it if you're not careful. It's good to keep the decal wet while you're sliding it into position so it doesn't try to stick to the car and rip itself apart as you're moving it. Getting it into the right position and angle can be quite tricky and requires some patience and a good eye, especially on the larger decals. Once it's in position, let the water dry a little bit and apply some microset. If your surface is flat, you're done. That's it. Unfortunately for us, only the name board on the top of the car was flat. Every other decal was applied to the car's wooden siding. So, in order to make sure it stuck just right, we had to occasionally apply more microset to let the decal adhere to the surface better and fit within the cracks between the wooden boards. This took a while. In fact, it took so long that I wasn't going to get the video out on time if I did both sides of the car. Like, we waited 20 to 30 minutes between applying new coats of microset to the decals, and we probably applied around 7 coats before it really looked passable. Considering we only did this in the last night before I wanted this video published, yeah, we'll just finish the other side of the car later. It's not the only piece of unfinished business we had to leave behind for this project, unfortunately. I also wanted to add some passengers to the car interior. We ordered a set of seated passengers through the train shop my father works at, as he gets a hefty discount for working there, but the shipping time wasn't quite fast enough for my goal of getting out this video by September 3rd. While I would show off the finished product, the reality is, we're not finished yet. I don't want to fully assemble the car since we need to add protective coating for the decals, and those passengers will need to sit inside the car. But we can still get a good idea of how everything is gonna look, right? Just don't put back the windows so they don't get covered when we add that protective coating later, and don't solder together the interior lighting so the car is easy to take apart in the future to add those passengers. It's really not hard to do, so it's time for the moment of truth. Put the trucks back on the frame, lacing the wires through the floor. Be smart this time and screw the floor and trucks back in before the walls are in place. Don't forget the bathroom and the partition wall. Latch on the walls, sliding the doors back into position at the same time. And last, but certainly not least, snap the roof back in place, and we're done. Could this be better? Honestly, yes. I think it looks a little bit cluttered with all that text on the side. But I'm still really proud of how this has turned out. It's certainly flashy, but it's not really garish anymore. It's a believable paint job. You could have seen something like this on a real narrow gauge railroad. And that's exactly what I was aiming for. I'm going to be doing a series building a model railroad on this channel, and this was just the pilot episode. I wanted to make sure everything would work logistically on my end, and it did pretty well, too. Most of the footage was recorded just over 2 days, with the decals and mock-up assembly being the only outliers. And this video style where I add in a voiceover to accompany the background footage is where I feel I work best. While it's true that I had to drag my father into this to help me build the car, his expertise took a backseat to my creativity as I spearheaded organizing this project and editing the video. I'm sure his presence will be a reoccurring theme on this channel before I really get my footing in the realm of modeling skills, though. If you liked this video, subscriptions seriously boost my ego and tell me what I'm doing is worth my time. Likes specifically tell me this particular video was good and point me in the right direction for the future of this channel. If you feel like helping current and future projects by supporting me financially, I've got both YouTube memberships and Ko-Fi. Members of all types will occasionally get bonus videos, though I get more money directly from Ko-Fi subscriptions than membership tiers with similar perks. Whatever you wind up doing, though, thanks for tuning in today, and I hope you enjoyed this little endeavor of an amateur model rarer trying something outside their comfort zone. Maybe I'll see you in the next one. Cheers, folks.